name is Rachel Baker. I am Director of the UNIS Centre for Social Business and Health here at Glasgow, Caledonian. That's one of our research centres. But tonight I'm standing in for the Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research, Professor Andrea Nelson, and I'm absolutely delighted to do that. I did Andrea's job very briefly for about 6 months, and this is, I can tell you, the best part of that job, so I'm thrilled to be in. Before I get started, some housekeeping. Before I forget, we aren't expecting a fire alarm. If you hear the alarm, accessible exit here or up the stairs and out onto just the main campus there. There are accessible loos left and right, but Marissa is outside and can direct you. And there'll be, at the end of the lecture, a chance to gather over, I think, a glass of wine and some canapes, maybe, we're lucky. And that will be in the George Moore restaurant, so we'll direct you to that when the time comes. But let me spend 5 minutes or so just introducing you to our Professorial lecture series and to Fiona, our speaker for tonight. The Professorial lecture series is about the public role that universities have, which for GCU as the University for the Common Good is about our research speaking to the Sustainable Development Goals issued by the United Nations in 2015. And it's about how we make really excellent research also impactful and accessible. Professorial lectures are an opportunity for newly promoted professors to showcase their work and their career achievements to colleagues, to research collaborators, and of course to family and friends. And I'm pleased to see all of you here tonight. Fiona has with her Scott and Lewis, her parents Eric and Moira, as well as other family, friends and colleagues. Many of you are visiting GCU for the first time tonight. You're all very, very welcome. And so, allow me to introduce Fiona. Fiona Skillen is Professor in History in the Department of Social Science in Glasgow School for Business and Society. Her research interests cover aspects of sport, gender, health and popular culture. Her PhD research focused on the ways in which these discourses impinged on and were negotiated by women who wished to participate in sport in the interwar period. Fiona took time out of academia to work in the Heritage sector and then returned to a postdoc at the University of Central Lancashire, where her PhD research was developed further and then published as a book, Women, Sport and Modernity in Interwar Britain. Since then, she's focused on historical patterns and experiences of participation, aspects of women's sports participation, including volunteering and the Commonwealth Games. She is past chair of the British Society of Sport History. She sat on the executive committee of Scottish Women in Sport. In 2014, she was named a BBC Woman Expert for her research on women's sport history. She was investigator in a European Union-funded project called VolPower, looking at how volunteering in sports and arts can contribute to youth interaction and empowerment. She's an editor for the International Journal of History of Sport and sits on various committees and editorial boards. Huge accolades. She's starting to blush, I think. More personally, outside of work, Fiona likes to go to the theatre with friends, watch old films, particularly those of Bette Davis, and she's a Hearts fan.
Controversial. I hid it so well.
One of the things I noticed looking across Fiona's publications, so in the titles of your journal articles and book chapters are some sort of enviable quotes that all academics would love to have in the titles of their papers, such as, constitutionally and physically, women are unfitted for golf. Thoughts on the development of women's golf in the United Kingdom. Do tennis girls make good wives? Which is about media representation of women's sports. The game of football is quite unsuitable for females and ought not to be encouraged. Anyway, I'm looking forward to hearing more, Fiona. Tonight, speaking about Sidelined, the problematic history of women's sport, please join me in welcoming, to celebrate the latest in her career achievements, Professor Fiona Skillen.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and you're all so welcome. I want to start this evening I couldn't not have Betty somewhere in the lecture, and I think that sums up very nicely the experiences of being a woman in academia, but also the experiences of women's sport, as hopefully we're going to see over the course of this evening. I was told that, unfortunately, I have to talk a little bit about myself and my journey. So that's what we're going to start the lecture with, and then we're going to move on to look a little bit more in detail at women's sports history and a particular area of research, the area of women's football, which I've been working on most recently, and public history, which has become a theme throughout many of my projects, finishing with a few thank yous to many of you in the room. Ah, wasn't I cute? Grew out of that very quickly. So how did I end up making a career studying sport? I'm not, nor have I ever been what one might consider a gym bunny. Despite coming from a relatively sporty family, my dad was a low handicap golfer, my mum sailed at Strathclyde Park, my uncles, two of whom are here today, were also very good golfers, as was my papa. My parents met when my dad was out running, something he has never done since, I have to add. Not sure if those two things are connected. So how did I, the least sporty person you could ever hope to meet, end up making a career that has been so immersed in sport? I think I can trace it back to this image. When I was little, I played golf with my dad regularly. Not having a son was certainly not going to stop him from passing down his knowledge and his skills on the golf course to his offspring. My sister was very quick to duck out of these games and come up with ever-inventive excuses to avoid them, but I stuck with it, and over time I became a half-decent player and actually really enjoyed it. And it was in this context that I remember having my first ever taste of inequality, of raw, unvarnished sexism. I must have been about 5 or 6, so probably about the same age as I am in this photograph. I've just completed my first 18 holes, that's why I'm cheering in this photograph, by the way. I was at the local golf course, and the upstairs floor of the golf course is a large lounge room. 2/3 of the room is a gents' lounge, and 1/3 is the mixed lounge. And there was a painted stripe on the floor that demarked the two separate areas. And I remember vividly running at full pelt, one of the few occasions I've done that, across this line, and my dad shouting at me and saying, "You can't go into the gents' lounge." And I said, "Why can't I go into the gents' lounge? It's the same as the mixed lounge." "You can't go into the gents' lounge because you're a girl." And that really stuck with me. That was the first time I remember being told that I couldn't do something simply because I was a girl, and it infuriated me. And so ever since then, I have tried to push back on everyday sexism, often to my parents' bewilderment from that age. My path to professor has not been a conventional one. Although increasingly I recognise there is no conventional path in academia. I studied at the University of Glasgow for my undergraduate degree with social and economic history, jointly with history. My intention since I'd been very young had been to become a history teacher, and in my 4th year I applied to Jordan Hill College to do teacher training and was accepted. However, fate intervened in a rather unexpected way. One of my lecturers invited me to a meeting and suggested that I should apply for a scholarship from the ESRC to do a master's and a PhD at the university. I was flattered, but I was also very, very unsure. Looking back, I now recognise it as the seeds of imposter syndrome starting to be sown. I needed to find a topic for my application. I was a real sucker, and still am, for 1930s and 40s Hollywood. Any rainy Sunday afternoon, you will find me happily curled up on the sofa watching the classics from the era, with Betty Davis being my heroine. So I gleefully skipped back to my supervisor's office and proclaimed that I wanted to study women in classic Hollywood films. My supervisor smiled and gently burst my bubble, as supervisors often have to do. She explained that this topic had been done back to front and sideways, and really there was no merit in pursuing this, and it was unlikely to be funded. Was there anything else I might consider? As she smiled at me across the desk. My mind immediately went to my experiences of playing golf. So I put in a proposal saying that I would look at the history of women's sport, and luckily I was awarded funding. I undertook my PhD and Masters at the University of Glasgow in the Department of Social and Economic History under the supervision of Professor Eleanor Gordon, pictured here, with my good friend Dr. Valerie Wright. And my other supervisor was Anne-Marie Hughes. My research focused on women's sports experiences in interwar Scotland and drew predominantly on qualitative research through the collection of oral history, interviews, and the interrogation of various archival materials from different sports organisations, government and council organisations. And it was examined by Professor Dick Holt, who is also, I'm delighted to say, in the audience this evening. So I would like to say hello and a massive thank you to my supervisors who got me through the PhD and to the friends that I made along the way at that time. My experiences in those years, I've come to recognise, have shaped me profoundly as a researcher and as a colleague in a very fundamental way. It was during that time that the first seeds of public history and the approach to research dissemination were sown in me. And that's something I'm going to talk about shortly, as it's become very central to my work. This was also a very formative time in my personal life, as it was one rainy morning, Lewis, don't listen to this. It was one rainy morning over breakfast with friends in the QMU, very hungover, that I first met Scott. We would go on to marry and have our beautiful son, Lewis. They have been my rock and my support, and Lewis, you are our joy every single day. After my PhD, I worked in the heritage sector for a few years. Firstly, at the Wanlock Head Museum of Lead Mining, where I was employed as a researcher on the museum's galleries funded project, writing the history of the Miners' Lending Library, which is pictured here, the white building. It's the second oldest lending library in Europe, and Wanlock Head is the highest village in Scotland, worth a look if you're ever in the neighbourhood. From there, I went on to join the Good Cause Project. This project aimed to commemorate the 1909 Edinburgh Suffrage March with a year of events which culminated in the reenactment of that march, where 5,000 people joined us to march through the city centre of Edinburgh. Both of these roles were public-facing and publicly engaged in the telling of histories through workshops, through talks, through art, through music and literature. They demonstrated to me the powerful and meaningful impact that history can have, particularly forgotten histories and overlooked histories can have and can resonate with people now. Something that I'm passionate about and which I think aligns really well with GCU's ethos of being the university for the common good, where our research is shaped by and for the benefit of wider society. From there, I took up a research assistance role at the University of Central Lancashire for a few years, followed by my first job here at GCU in a temporary appointment in the sports department, which no longer exists, but that was nothing to do with me. My roles at UCLan and GCU allowed me the space and support that I needed to develop my sports history research and to build on the findings and the ideas that I had really just started to scratch at during the course of my PhD. So what about women in sports history? When I first began my research into women's sports history, it was clear that women were missing largely from the academic and mainstream literature. You could easily be forgiven for thinking that, based on these books and general knowledge, that women didn't really participate in sport before the 20th century. But how wrong that assumption is. I was determined to find out about women who played sport, those that pushed the boundaries directly and vocally, and sometimes those that did it quietly and unassumingly simply by playing. So why was it the case that women's experiences had been consistently missed by historians and cultural commentators? Well, in short, there was, and to an extent there remains, a hierarchy of historical merit within the discipline, which at best marginalises women's sporting experiences and at worst totally excluded them from the historical narrative as participants. Jeff Hill noted recently that one of the most overlooked aspects of sports history, of British sports history, is the place of women within it. In America and Canada, things progressed much earlier with the works of Patricia Vertinsky, Roberta Park, and Catriona Parrott. But in Britain, there were really no women's sports historians. There were, however, a handful of sports and gender sociologists who led the way. And I was inspired by the work in particular of Professor Jennifer Hargreaves, who worked to recover the voices of women and to understand the role of sport in everyday life. So not exceptional women who are winning Olympic medals, but women who were incorporating sport into their everyday stories. So this is surprising when we stop to consider that the body has been revealed as a critical site upon which understandings of women's experiences can be inscribed. From this perspective, sport historically as now can be understood as a site of contestation, one successfully mobilised by sporting women. And secondly, in spite of increases in female participation since the late 20th century, leading arguably to greater visibility of women in sport, sport still remains one of the most resilient bastions of male power and gendered participation, the latter of which is based upon prevailing understandings of sex difference and is a subject of great debate currently. There are also a number of challenges of studying women's history and women's sports history. Often stories and tangible material culture from women's lives have not been preserved in the archives. A bias towards preserving what has been perceived to be important history by others over every day has meant that women's experiences are often hard to find. And this is certainly the case when we're looking at sport. Another challenge, as Hill has noted, is that it's not simply a matter of filling the gaps, but of confronting fundamental problems with the epistemology. So while I wanted to study women's sport in all areas, I was aware of the potential danger of simply adding women into the pre-existing and long-established historiographies of sport. That is, historiographies that have been framed around and defined by the male experience. I've tried, therefore, to explore women's sport on its own terms, as an aspect of physical culture, because women's competitive and recreational experiences have fundamentally diverged and still do from those of men, not least due to the discrimination that they have experienced historically. And so to try to mould the experiences of girls and women to fit into the timelines and the narratives that have been established on the basis of male sporting interests does a disservice to the unique experiences of both genders. I'm glad to say that in the last decade or so, things have changed quite remarkably in the UK. There are far more people studying women's sports history. Women are now routinely included and featured in large-scale studies of sport. Some of the touchstone books of the discipline, such as Dick Holt's seminal text, Sport and the British, are being revised to include women's experiences. My own work, which examines specific sports such as tennis, hockey, golf, football, and events such as the Commonwealth Games and the Curtis Cup, have demonstrated that women have enjoyed mixed fortunes in sport over the past 140 years or so. These studies have highlighted positively that the hitherto hidden scope of participation that exists, as well as the complex interactions and responses that have been generated by women participating in sport across time and place. And it's also been possible to show that women are not an undifferentiated mass, that their participation has been contingent upon a number of important factors: stage in life cycle, social class, sexual identity, national identity, ethnicity, and even religion have all played a role in the way that women have been able to engage in sport. So we're now going to look at football in particular. So if you were to walk into your local library or Waterstones and pick any book about Scottish football off the shelves, I would bet you good money that there would be no mention of women's football within its pages. Even some of the most important books which record the history of the game, such as the Scottish Football Annuals, the Hampden Story, 10 Days That Shook Scotland, make no mention that women played football, never mind that their game has a long and rich history. And yet, women have been playing football in Scotland since 1628. I was intrigued and ever so slightly annoyed that our beautiful game had been so badly overlooked. So for the next part of the lecture, I'm going to focus on my more recent research, which has been the mapping of the history of the women's game in Scotland. This started life as a small project funded by FIFA through their educational charity, CIES, and has grown beyond anything that I could have imagined possible. I'm going to just very briefly highlight some of the notable findings from this research, but I'm very happy to take questions on it at the end. And then I will talk briefly about some of the public history outputs from the project. Mapping the earliest association matches was perhaps one of the easier aspects of this project. The first formal association game took place in May in 1881 at Hibs, boo hiss, at Hibs ground. However, the good news is this England-Scotland game was won by Scotland 3-0. Yay! If only that was a trend that had continued. However, the first goal was scored by Lily Sinclair, and she's recorded as the first ever woman to have scored an association goal. The second game, a week or so later, took place in Glasgow at Shawfield and ended in a riot, with the team having to be rescued by the police and physically driven away from the ground because the crowd were attacking them. A third match was scheduled for Kilmarnock, but was cancelled when the local magistrate intervened and said it was far too scandalous to have women playing football in Kilmarnock. Ironic that Rose Riley subsequently came from Kilmarnock. The reason for this was the ideology of separate spheres. So this was a social construct, an ideology that people were expected to live by, whereby women functioned within the private sphere. They were seen to be genteel, they were seen to be very feminine, they were expected to look after their families, and men dominated the public sphere. Football was very much within the public sphere, was seen as a male sport, and women who played football were going against all of these ideals. They were taking part in a sport that was seen to be not just masculine, but actually really physically dangerous for them, very scandalous for them to play. The media coverage and indeed the riot indicate the negative attitudes towards women attempting to play this game. I should also say that these women were playing for money as well, which again was seen as being very controversial, that they were trying to make money from their sport. We can see from the quotes on the slide some of the media attitudes towards the women who were playing. These matches were given quite substantial column inches, but most of them focused on the clothes that the women wore, their hair, their appearance, and many of them questioned their femininity. Some of them questioned their gender as well. There was really very little about the match itself, or indeed about the football skills that were displayed. The team moved on from Scotland and went down to England and were met with very similar unrest and hostility in their remaining half a dozen matches, and the teams very quickly disbanded. And that was it until the end of 1895, when another team emerged. This was the British Ladies Football Club, which was founded near London. It toured extensively in Scotland. They played over 20 matches in that year, across Scotland from Wishaw to Inverness and many places in between. Wherever they went, they caused controversy. Newspaper reports highlighted the negative reception they received, and often matches were interrupted or abandoned by crowd violence. And we have examples of the women being physically assaulted, black eyes and so forth. The team was an A side and a B side because there was no one for them to play, so they had to make sure they took their opposition around with them. And the team eventually disbanded after various financial and social scandals, which if you really want to know the juicy stuff, you'll have to buy my book when it comes out next year. But the point of all this is simply to highlight that this history really hasn't been explored or mapped properly in Scotland until now. Another area that I was rather curious about was women as football fans. I think we often assume that women football fans emerged in the 1990s as part of Luddite culture. But in actual fact, I've been able to find evidence of women going to games in the 1880s and the 1890s in Scotland. Now, being cynical, one could say there were economic reasons for women being encouraged to come to the football. They could charge them money, although many clubs actually let women in for free. But there was also another reason. Many people assumed that having women in the crowd would be a civilizing influence. There were huge problems about behaviour within crowds at football matches. And so if women were encouraged, they believed that men would be less likely to swear, to drink to excess, to gamble, and to fight. There's very little evidence to suggest that actually was effective. If anything, the women joined in. There was also a perception that women were not capable of understanding the complexity of the rules of football as well. And there's quite a lot in the media about women coming and looking pretty, but not really understanding it, and certainly not being football supporters and being passionate about the game. And so we have an example here from the Edinburgh Evening Dispatch under the topic, "Should ladies attend football matches?" arguing that actually it was very dangerous for women to go to football matches. It was, quote, "undermining their own gentleness, tenderness and sympathy. And as such, the sport was not one that women ought to take pleasure in witnessing." So they saw it as corrupting the women rather than civilising the men. Meanwhile, a retort in the Daily Record we can see here from a female football fan, which I think is very unusual, where she argues that in actual fact, she thoroughly enjoys the game and she understands the game because, as she explains, she studied it through newspaper reports, through talking to other friends who go to the game, and to going to watch the game herself, and that she now follows the players' movements with intelligent appreciation. So again, what I hope I've tried to show here is that women were football fans from this early time, not in significant numbers, but some women were supporting the game. And this is an area that I would very much like to pursue further. The other area that has developed is women's football during the First World War. I think if I asked most of you at the start of this lecture, you would be able to tell me that the First World War was an important point for women's football. I have tried to map the teams that played in Scotland during the First World War. And again, there's evidence that women were playing right across the Central Belt, as one might expect, in munitions factories, in mills, even in the shipyards on the Clyde. But they were also playing in the north of Scotland. Some of the women who were in the Forestry Commission were playing football. We have women in the laundry in Tain playing football. And oddly, a really big collection of teams in Arbroath, which I was not expecting. In the mills and the forges around Arbroath, women were playing. Now, in the early years of the war, it was tricky to find opposition. And so often these women's teams, who were playing for charity to raise money for war funds, which I think explains partly why they didn't have a hostile experience. People actually encouraged them to play and were quite positive about them playing. But they found it hard to find opposition, and so often they played against men's teams. But it wasn't fair, it wasn't seen to be fair, it was seen to be quite dangerous for women to play against able-bodied men. And so what they did was they would often play against injured soldiers who had returned to recuperate from the front. They would play against young men who were too young to be called up. Or they would play against able-bodied men who had been disabled in some way. So we can see two examples on this slide. The first one, if you look very carefully at the back row, there are 3 men in drag in that photograph. It always surprises me when people don't notice that. When I put it up straight away, I'm like, those are just really ugly women. No, those are boys with moustaches. So they played against men in drag. Sometimes they would dress up as popular characters. So we have an example in Dundee of Charlie Chaplin making an appearance at one match. So the idea is that this is not serious. This is something fun. This is something lighthearted. Nobody is taking the sport itself seriously. And that's kind of how they get away with this. The other example we have here is Sadie Smith, who I will talk about shortly, who played for Rutherglen Ladies, in her lovely tartan shorts, taking a shot at goal. Now, what you probably can't see clearly is that this goalie has his arms tied behind his back. So again, this was a common feature that players would have their hands tied behind their backs, and I've even got an example where they blindfolded the goalie to give women a sporting chance. So this is in spite of the fact that actually many of these women were very skilled at football and probably could have taken on some of these men very fairly. But it wasn't seen to be the right thing to do. It was seen to be just too controversial to do that. So the women's game really flourished in Scotland during the First World War. However, trouble was on the horizon. We think the end of the war would bring some hope, but in actual fact, the opposite was true of women's football. So again, many of you will know that a ban was brought in women's football. Did you know? Yeah, some of you are nodding. So there was a ban brought in 1921 by the Football Association in England to limit women playing football. Now, this was part of a bigger movement in society to get back to pre-war conditions where women's roles were very clearly demarked. So women were encouraged to leave their wartime roles. They were encouraged to go back to their families and the types of jobs that they had before. This, I think, is probably one of the most stark examples of that, of trying to keep women in their place. The ban was brought in on the basis of two things. The FA argued, firstly, that women were not physically suited to playing football, but they were also not capable of making that decision for themselves, and so to protect them, they were stepping in. Okay. The second thing they said was that the women's game is corrupt. Slightly ironic coming from the FA. That's on film. So yeah, it was corrupt. Again, we have very little evidence of that funding from these charity matches during the war was not making its way to the charities. But anyway, those were the two explanations that they gave, and they kind of wheeled out various experts from Harley Street, from the church, to back up this particular stance. The ban itself did not say women could not play football. What it said was that women could not play football at any pitch or stadium that was a member of a club that was associated to the Football Association, and that they also couldn't use any linesmen or referees. So the only way to be a qualified linesman or referee was through the FA. So basically they're undermining the legitimacy of women's games by not having officially trained and recognised officials for their matches. Now again, if we look at the literature and the historiography, there has been an assumption that this ban in 1921 in England simply rolled out across the UK and Ireland and wider into Europe. But again, this research has been able to demonstrate that in Scotland, we didn't have a ban formally put in place in 1921. What we had was arguably much worse. What we did was we simply actively discouraged any clubs from allowing women to play football. So we did it all very informally, which makes it much harder to object and to push back against it. So I'm just very quickly going to show you an example of women playing football. And this newsreel came out in December 1921, just as the ban was coming into place. It's silent, so don't worry if you can't hear anything. Okay, so that just gives you a flavour of what we're talking about. So the ban in Scotland became formalised in the 1940s after the Second World War. And that ban remained in place into the 1970s. In 1970, UEFA wrote to all of its members, all 31 members, and asked them two questions. Firstly, is the women's game growing in your country? And secondly, would you lift any restrictions that you have in place and support the growth of the game? 30 nations came back and said, yes, it's growing, and yes, we will lift any restrictions. One nation, I'm going to make you proud in a minute, one nation said no. They said, the game is growing, but nobody's that interested. We're going to keep our ban in place, and that was Scotland. So we have this weird situation where the ban is lifted across mainland Europe and the UK in 1971, but we continue to hold on for grim life till 1974. And the only reason that the SFA give it up in 1974 is because there are equalities legislations coming through Westminster down in London that they know is going to put them in a really difficult position. And so they very quietly lift the ban. There's just one note, Karen, isn't there? There's one note in the record books. There is no press release, there is no media coverage, there is no fanfare, and there is most certainly no attempt to encourage the women's game or provide funding or any kind of support to the women's game. So in effect, the ban doesn't really change in terms of women's position in Scotland. And finally, the other story that has emerged from this research, and in particular this study I did with Steve Bolton, looking at the history of Rutherglen Ladies FC. So this was a small team that came from, as the name suggests, Rutherglen, just outside Glasgow, actually where I was born. And this team played for approximately 20 years. They played all over Scotland. They emerged in 1921 when many of these war teams were folding because women were leaving their jobs, were going back to their homes, and because of the hostility to women's football. And J.H. Kelly, who founded Rutherglen Ladies, was really smart. He went round and he handpicked the best players from these teams across Scotland to create this kind of superstar lineup and a B-side that travelled with them often to play. So they played across Scotland. They played in Ireland twice. They had two tours to Ireland, which again was unheard of and was really significant because women's football in Ireland was very much suppressed. So again, this was a very controversial thing to do. And they toured into England as well. They played for charity, which was, again, important, meant they didn't get much of a backlash for their playing. And they were, I would argue, Scotland's greatest team pre-1950s. And yet, until 2022, really nobody outside of Rutherglen had heard about their story. And so we've worked very hard to kind of deep dive into the story to find out where they played, who they played, the uniform they played in. So these were bright Buchanan tartan shorts, bright red shorts that they played in, to share that story and to trace some of the women who played as well. And we've done a lot of kind of genealogical research and made contact with families of women who played, including Sadie Smith, who was the star striker. And it turned out that her granddaughter was Eddie Reader, the singer. So that was an amazing story. And when we met Eddie and talked to her about it, the family had no idea that Sadie had had this epic career playing football. And she said the only thing, when she asked her aunts and uncles about it, the only thing that came back was one uncle said that he had been playing football in the back court of their tenement in Rutherglen, Rockhill actually, and somebody leant over a fence and said, "You're good, son, but you're not as good as your ma." And he didn't understand what that meant, and nobody understood what that meant. And suddenly this story makes sense because of this piece of research. So I hope that this research has raised more questions possibly than it has given answers in terms of women's football. But what I think it has shown is that women's sport often takes one step forward and two steps back. It's a bumpy journey. It's not a straightforward trajectory of progress. The development of women's football is a pattern. In 1921, we see the backlash against the rapid growth and celebration of the game during the First World War. Again, if we fast forward to 2012 and 2014, with the Olympics, with the Euros, women's football was taking off in a really significant way. And then COVID happened. And the first games to be shut down were the women's games. The men's games continued, and often the men's grassroots even continued. But the women's professional game was shut down very, very quickly. So I think this historical research helps us to understand that there are patterns to behaviour. We can anticipate some of the bias that is going to occur and the discrimination that is going to occur. So in the final section of my lecture, I want to talk about public history. It's a commonplace expectation now for academics to embed impact and engagement within their funding bids to major UK funding bodies, and indeed it's now a mandatory part of the Research Excellence Framework. That is the UK-wide assessment of academic research, where people come in and evaluate the work that we do. And one of the areas that they now evaluate is wider engagement and impact. It's become a vital part of many of the projects that I've worked on, and I've highlighted a few of them here. I have been lucky enough to be on television programmes and documentaries, to be on podcasts. In particular, one of the highlights for me was being invited to be part of Sport and the British on Radio 4, which was a 30-part series presented by Claire Balding, based on the work of Dick Holt, which looked at the development of sport. And I was asked to be involved in that programme to talk about women's sport across time. Martin Jones has highlighted that we cannot rely on some vague notion that the research we as academics produce will automatically feed or trickle down into popular knowledge and understanding. We have to actively facilitate that, and I have tried to do that, and in fact it's something I absolutely love to do. On the top you can see some examples as well of plays that I have been involved in consulting on, and there's also been exhibitions and heritage trails and all sorts of things. I'm really up for trying any kind of public engagement within reason. So in terms of this football research, there have been a number of outputs. We made a documentary with Purple TV for BBC Alaba, looking at Eddie's story and her granny's story, a kind of rip-off of Who Do You Think You Are, tracing that story around the Rutherglen team's story. Steve and I put together an exhibition with the Scottish Football Museum, which was there for about 8 months, and then it has toured across Scotland, including the Scottish Parliament. We have developed educational resources with the SFA to go into schools. I was invited to become part of the Hampden collection and contribute to the launch of the Football Square Mile project. My research is important because it's helped to understand better current inequalities in the women's game. By looking at the historic treatment of sportswomen and their marginalisation, we can start to understand why women's sport is less well funded, is less well regarded, receives only 5% of traditional printed media coverage. My research can be used to argue that we need to address these imbalances, to promote diverse narratives, to celebrate pioneers, and to promote role models. As part of that, I have been invited to be part of the Scottish Football Association's CAPS project. So anyone who represents their country in sport is awarded a cap. But the women who played for Scotland at football between 1972 and 1997, none of them received caps. So what we're now doing is working to trace those women, to find out which games they played in, to find them, to invite them to Hampden when the Scottish women's team is playing there, and to award them their caps and to generally celebrate their contribution to the women's game. And that's been brilliant. It's also been quite challenging because some of the women are like, too little, too late. And we're trying to explain, no, things have changed and it's really important that you are part of that history and we acknowledge that. I've also been invited to be part of the panel looking at the Scottish Football Hall of Fame. So in 2004, the Football Hall of Fame was launched, and since then, 122 footballers have been inducted into it. Fantastic. Only 2 of those are women. So Rose Riley and Julie Fleeting. And it's not because there are no women footballers that are good enough to feature, far from it. This year, the Football Museum Trust decided to tackle the issue by establishing a committee of experts to advise on gender parity within the hall and to help select women to be inducted annually. I was invited to be part of that committee. You can see me on the bottom there with the rest of the panellists. And just 2 weeks ago, I was at the Scottish Women's Football Awards, where I helped to induct the first of these women. The 1881 team you remember from earlier are now inducted into the Hall of Fame, which I think is quite remarkable. Thank you. So to finish up, this year marks the 50th anniversary of the lifting of that ban in Scotland, and myself and my co-collaborators or conspirators, Dr. Karen Fraser and Julie McNeill, decided we needed to do something to mark that anniversary. So we edited this book. It's about 80% poetry. There are poems from people who have just started writing, who've been at workshops, there are young people who've written poems, and there are really established poets like former Macker, Jackie Kay, who have all contributed to this book. Arranged around themes, it also includes oral history interviews with women who played and administered the game since the 1950s. There are profiles of players that are short snapshot essays about the history of the game. That's a tongue twister. And all the royalties from this book are going back into grassroots football, and I'm immensely proud of it. It is available in all good bookshops and online, shameless plug. But before I move on to my last slide, I'd like to invite my pal and co-editor, Julie McNeill, to read 2 of the poems from the book that I think sum up really nicely some of the issues about grappling with trying to find women's stories, but also the challenge of being a woman in the 21st century. Julie.
What a fantastic honour to be part of doing Action Fiona. It's been such a joy to work with Karen and Fiona on this beautiful book that's charted the history of women's football, so I feel really privileged to be here. Thank you. The first poem is called History, and it's really looking at those kind of lost histories of women's football and how difficult it is to piece that together. History. The Scotland's first 11 shine from a poster on her bedroom wall. Caroline, Martha, Jamie Lee. I tried to trace that thread, following the line that brought us to this settled ground, piecing together, scrolling. I find snippets in footnotes, addendums, clues buried in unrelated places, obscure articles and off-the-cuff comments, headlines such as, "Are you near Fir Park tomorrow? Take the wife with you to see the lady footballers." Threads fray and fuse before I find the end. It's like holding mist in your fingertips, wondering, where did your history go? And this second poem is called Pressure, and I wrote this when the Scottish women's national team were going to the World Cup in France, and Shelley Kerr was in charge at the time, and she was being interviewed by journalists, and they kept saying, "Are the girls feeling the pressure yet? Are they feeling the pressure? Are they feeling the pressure now?" And I thought, well, yeah, fine, they're going to the World Cup. They're going to feel the pressure. Pressure. When he asks if we're feeling the pressure, the answer is we felt it all our lives. Just the right amount to squeeze a pal's hand when she is breaking, or to cup my daughter's face and tell her she's more than good enough. The extra hours spent burning the midnight oil to prove you're just as smart as them. To then get up and burn that oil again. The pressure in your legs when you drive hard towards the goal. Determined, you'll earn your place as the team's one and only girl. The pressure to look or feel or be as they'd expect. Nothing more and nothing less. So when he asks if we're feeling the pressure of a nation on our backs, our answer is, aye, but we girls know a thing or two about that.
Thanks, Julie. That was brilliant. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank everyone who's come along tonight from near and far and through this awful weather. It means a great deal to me to be able to look out and see so many of my friends, my family, my colleagues, and my students. I've tried to get as many of you on the slide as I could, but it turns out some of you are quite camera shy, so apologies if you're not there. It's a cliche to say that for someone to succeed, it takes a village, but I genuinely believe that it does. Reflecting over my career so far, while writing this lecture, I've realised that the various jobs I've held, the projects I've worked on, the colleagues I've worked with, the events I've been asked to be part of through my research over the years. I've always been so lucky to have met good people along the way. People who've taken a chance on me, people who have seen things in me that I often couldn't see in myself. People who have joyfully uplifted others, something I try very hard to do myself. You know who you are, and a massive thank you to each and every one of you. Here's to more of these exciting times ahead. Thank you.
I think we've got 5 minutes for some questions, but before I come to the audience, I would like to invite Lewis, please. Come to the front.
Thank you. Oh, you're super fair. Is that all right? You're brilliant. Thank you. I'm going to sit that in. Thank you.
So we have a few minutes before not to let that hurry you, but I'll open it to the floor. Any questions or thoughts for Fiona? Yes, to the back.
I come from like a business management perspective of the sport.
Yeah.
I was just wondering, in terms of the women's game, do you believe that having the men and women playing under the same logo and the same badge, do you think that gives the women a fair opportunity, or does it give the managers an opportunity to say that they're not a priority?
Yeah. I have insights into a few different clubs at the moment, and I can say in some clubs it's definitely benefiting the women, and in other clubs it's detrimental to the women as well. That again, like I was saying about COVID, that the men's team is always the priority, that's always the dominant story, that's always the area of investment, and it makes sense, because if you're looking at it as a business, that's where the largest income is. I mean, at the moment I would say probably the professional teams in particular are running at a loss. But again, we can only change that by increasing the fan base, by increasing the opportunities for people to come and support, by playing in venues that hold more fans, by encouraging them, by having matches at times that people can come to. So I think there are lots more things that can be done, but I think even just looking in the last few years, there's been tremendous progress. But there are still a number of challenges. And I think you can see that within the Scottish game, when we compare that to the English game, and just how stratospheric that has gone. Even the Welsh game has gone, has mushroomed in the last few years. So Scotland is behind, but I'm hopeful that we will catch up. Okay.
Anybody else? I see two more hands. I'll come to you first, and then over to you then. Yes.
Why did Scotland hang on for another 3 years?
Well, Ben, I don't think I need to tell you. Old-fashioned misogyny. Old-fashioned misogyny. I can't see any other reason. I know certainly from oral histories that have been done, there were women agitating for the ban to be lifted. They were agitating for more support. And the kinds of things that they were coming up against were absolutely without and out sexism. I think it was Willie Allen, who was the head of the SFA, told one woman that they couldn't play because of these. That was what he said. He couldn't bring himself to say breasts and that they would get in the way or that they would be damaged or whatever, but he had that old-fashioned view that really women biologically just weren't suited to playing this sport, and that was in the 70s. So that was around this time that we're talking about. So yeah, pretty shocking, but perhaps not that unsurprising. And we still see the misogyny in the game in Scotland. So it's very deep-rooted. Daniel.
I found it really, really interesting, the comment there about the movement of stadiums. So
Yeah.
in England this week, they've had to move a game in England to
Yeah.
a larger stadium
Yeah.
for the women's game.
Yeah.
Why do you think that rhetoric is hidden? Why do you think it goes to another element of it, they change the direction of the conversation?
I think that's a really challenging one. So we know that the women's team were playing at Hampden recently and that they weren't filling the stadium. Arguably, they perhaps weren't promoting it as effectively as they could. The timing of the matches was very poor. So if we think about the makeup of fans that come to watch women's football, it's generally families. It's a very different crowd that come. And so having a match at 8 o'clock on a Tuesday night is no good for those fans. So again, we need to start to take into consideration who our fan base are, how we grow that. I mean, there are lots of problems as well with Hampden. It's not a great stadium for atmosphere unless it's absolutely packed. And so I'm sure it's a strategic decision. I don't know, because I haven't talked to anyone at the SFA, that they've now moved it to Easter Road, which is a much better stadium. It's probably easier to fill, it's more centrally located. So I think they are trying to do things in Scotland to promote and to grow the women's game. But I think there's probably a lot more that can be done and should be done, and that we can learn from some of these other nations that clearly are doing it very successfully.
I've got some questions that came in online, and partly because you raised it in your lecture, I wonder if I could pose one of them to you. It comes from Mary Claire. What role do the media play in inequality, and how can this be improved?
Yeah, so I think the media is, particularly historically, has been very responsible in terms of sort of purporting certain narratives, promoting certain narratives rather, that undermine women's sport. Again, we tend to see, when you look historically at women's photographs of women in the media, they're never playing sport. It's always afterwards that they're posing when they're clean and they're neat and they're tidy and they're looking feminine and beautiful. It's very rare that they're actually sweaty and playing and in motion, for example. So we don't see that. That isn't promoted. Things are changing in the sense that social media, I think, now gives a better reach, that women can take hold of the narrative, that they can promote their stories to people who are interested in their particular sport or whatever it might be, particular event. But I do think the media is very problematic, actually. Yeah, and in turn sponsorship as well, and then it's that chicken and egg thing of, which comes first.
Fantastic professorial lecture.
Thank you.
Congratulations on that. And as a member of the Professorial, as well as it being absolutely clear that you're an excellent academic researcher, one of the things that really impressed me about some of what Fiona was saying tonight was that engagement piece. So your ability to get out there in lots and lots of different media, that it doesn't always come naturally to academic researchers. We can be very good at that part and not terribly good at the others. So I learned a lot, and also very inspirational to see that kind of, radio, podcast, plays, consulting plays, all of that. Fantastic. So congratulations, and please join me in congratulating.